Hi, I'm Mina Marcana, General Director of Spoleto Festival USA. Welcome to More on That Now, our virtual discussion series, which explores themes of the 2022 festival. The performing arts has a way of telling stories, stories of marginalized people, untold stories. And we had a few productions in this past festival, pieces like Omar and Unholy Wars, which went a step further. They were asking us, whose stories are we telling? Why are we telling those stories? And why do we study our history? So in order to explore these questions and the intersection of art and history, we've gathered an incredible panel that is chaired by our esteemed moderator, Dr. Hussein Rashid. Our panelists are, and you can read their description below, LaTisha Vaughn, an education consultant based in South Carolina Lowcountry, whose work is focused on increasing diversity among teachers and, by extension, achieving equitable outcomes for Black and brown children. Dr. Phillip Wilder, who is on the faculty of Clemson University, and whose interdisciplinary work concentrates on increasing literacy for more equitable schools. Kim Wilson at Winthrop University, who works with artists and educators to create interdisciplinary arts education for students throughout the South Carolina region. Dr. Rania Saeb, who works on Arab American cultural identity formations in the United States and works with educators to make sure that they are better serving their Arab American youth. I want to thank the panel for their discussion and thank the staff for putting together More on That Now, a highly valued discussion series that really provides further insight into what we do at Spoleto and how we do it. So without further ado, Hussein, over to you. Thank you very much.
It is a pleasure to be in such wonderful, august company, especially with such an education background as we begin to turn towards history and education. And I think probably one of the ways that I think I'd like us to begin thinking about this, if everybody's game for this, is thinking about how history is made. And LaTisha, would you mind starting us off on that?
Sure. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here to participate in this conversation. And I feel privileged because I feel like I'm in a room full of very, very smart people to be the first to answer this question. And so I think history is really a collection of stories and experiences that have occurred over time. And I think one of the things that we have to think about as we are thinking about history and how history is made is really who decides what stories are told. And so I think with the work that I do, particularly the work that I've done in schools around leading teachers and helping support curriculum implementation, many times, and now we're in the midst of Black History Month, right? And so many times we know that a lot of the stories that some people value are taught and some are not taught, right? So we know that lots of things maybe aren't included in history for whatever reason. But I also think that we have to think about the narratives that we value. We have to think about the stories that are told and why things are included and why some things are not included. Are important questions for us to grapple with as we have this conversation.
Thank you. On the question of stories, I'm struck by this notion of what stories do we value. And, when I was growing up and, I had to do New York, we have these Regents exams, history. The question was always, why do we study history? Right? There's always, you learn from the mistakes of the past, you're doomed to repeat it if you don't learn and all this. And I don't want to discount that. I think it's important. But I think what you're pointing at, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that there is a history to history that we're not talking about and not thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there's a history to history, why do we study history the way we do? This is not for LaTisha. This is for anybody who wants to take that. But how do we get to the point we're at now where we're studying the history the way we study history? I love stumping panelists.
Well, LaTisha, I was actually really struck by that comment as well, Hussein, when she was speaking of the value of the story and whose story gets told. And, thinking from the arts perspective and looking at that is one of the power within teaching history through the arts, is that those stories are told from the perspective of those who live it or who are observing it. And that there can be those contexts of different perspectives and which artwork sometimes gets elevated and they're placed in a museum or a place of prominence, while others maybe remain within their own communities or their own cultures. And as we unearth those objects and artifacts and stories, is that it helps bring new light to histories that may have been lost previously and the new stories that are being created. So I was just really struck, LaTisha, by that comment of being of value, because art can be very subjective to value and what gets placed where in those areas of prominence.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I was struck just by the words that you just used, Kim, of viewing artifacts and objects. And as a former high school history teacher and someone that has worked with history teachers for a long time, that often is not the practice that's in high school history classes, for example. So if you surveyed any of your friends at the next dinner party and you said, hey, what was your least favorite class in high school? How many people would say history? And as a former history teacher, I would admit that a lot of people would say that it was. And I think that is grounded in the way that the artifacts and the objects and the perspectives and the letters and the oral history, this is not just primary sources, but how those have been historically removed from the actual creation of history within classes and the weighing of historical narratives. And so I think much of that has been grounded in the use of a textbook. And if we think about a history textbook, for example, it's supposed to be objective. It's supposed to represent the facts of what happened. And more often than not, not throwing shade against those that write it, but you can't create history that is completely objective, because historians, when they write books, when they do their research, they expect debate. They know which people are going to disagree with them, and they're weighing historical narratives. So I really value the way that this is being framed, and that recognition that history is about people's stories. It's about objects. It's about artifacts. It's about my grandmother's diary. It's about lots of things that are not in a textbook.
And it's funny that you say that, Phillip, because if you were to ask me what subject I least enjoyed in growing up K to 12, it was history. And one of the main reasons, I believe, was because I never saw myself in that class. As an Arab American growing up in the United States, there was no identity for me in my classroom. I can count the number of times I've heard the word Arab in a classroom. And so it was very hard for me to make any sort of connection to the history that I was learning about, because I never learned about who I was. So there's such a disconnect, I think, for so many kids in the classrooms, because they're not learning about who they are, where their families come from, so their own history. So when we look at who decides or what stories are being told, many stories are being left out, and therefore causing so many different students to grow up feeling like they are invisible and they didn't count as part of history.
Absolutely.
I think, Rania, what you raise is, I hear building really well on what LaTisha, Kim, and Phillip said. Kim, I think you talked about lost histories, but Rania, what I'm hearing you saying is, these histories aren't necessarily lost; they're ignored. They're being written out, right? And there's a conscious decision, as opposed to being lost, where it fell out of my pocket or it fell out of my bag. No, no, no. We are pretending this doesn't exist. There's a much more consciousness. So again, the idea of how we craft and tell our stories.
Mhm.
And Phillip, you talked about this objective quality, and I think about, before I got into religious studies, before I started doing study of religion, I was in biology, and there was always a sort of progression, right? The biology you learned in elementary school is different than what you would learn in middle school. It's different than what you would learn in high school. It's different, right? But it would always build. So what you learned before wasn't wrong, but it wasn't the complete story, right? So there's always this unfolding and saying, okay, now you're ready to learn a little bit more. You're now ready to learn a little bit more, and so on. But for me, it feels like the way we teach history, and again, I'm going to speak very much from a New York perspective, which is home for me. It feels like we don't have that unfolding. The history that I learned in elementary school is the same history I was learning in AP, right? 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But we don't talk about Isabella kicking out the Muslim and the Jew, right? We don't connect Columbus's expedition with the Reconquista. That complexity doesn't happen. And to me, that sort of illustrates this idea that if you want to ignore history, it is impossible for you to ignore elements of history. It's impossible for you to tell complete notions of history. You're not doing revelations. You're not adding complexity. You're keeping it very simple. And I think that then relates to people being shocked when they meet complexity much later in life. They're not used to dealing with that. And I think, are there points in U.S. history where we can think about, I'm going to use history a lot in this question because I don't have other language right now, but are there points in U.S. history where teaching history has been contentious? How we do it, what's included?
Yeah, I want to jump in on that because of the work that we're currently doing. Right now, we see a swash of legislation across the country, bills that are attempting to be passed to censure or to eliminate certain aspects of history or the perspective of history being told. I think I live in South Carolina. Right now, there are 5 bills at the House and 1 at the Senate, which went to committee hearing yesterday. And these bills range from not teaching not teaching specifically about slavery, not teaching the 1619 Project, not teaching things that would make children feel guilty about history. And so I think that it is a huge issue because again, it goes back to me, the original conversation that we were having about whose history we value, how we make decisions about what is taught and what is important. As Dr. Wilder was saying, I was a principal in a school and participated in the state's how we select standards, right? How we select standards for social studies, math, science, and reading, and how we try to cram in, certain standards into certain classes. And so I think, to me, it just goes back to, again, do we value all perspectives? As Dr. Raina was saying, like, to talk about Arab Americans or even the Arab culture in classrooms is something that I never experienced, right? And representation is extremely important for all children. And so when we think about children being connected to school and children being connected to history and learning from it, it is very difficult to connect when you don't see yourself at all in a course that you're learning about.
I want to pick up that thread, LaTisha. It's, I think you and Rania have both have talked about this idea of not being seen and not being represented. And I want to maybe think about it a little bit in a broader context of how we teach history and what happens when that's left out. Okay. So we're having this panel in the context of the Spoleto Festival. This year, there will be a premiere of an opera called Omar, about an enslaved African Muslim, Omar ibn Saeb, who has connections to Charleston. And, I think that for some people to even hear that story, that there was an enslaved Muslim here, is a revelation to people. And then they realize, oh, in fact, 10 to 12% of all enslaved people were Muslim. And we have autobiographies that they wrote, which is part of the reason they're doing this opera on Omar, right? Is part of that story. But there's also a West African cultural element here, which is where enslaved peoples were brought from. So Renan Giddens, who's one of the creators of this opera, has done a lot of work on the roots of banjo in West Africa, right? We tend to think of West Africa. We tend to think of the banjo as a sort of country instrument, but it seems to have these connections to West Africa, which is where it comes from. And so how do you tell the story of the US without talking about the fact that an American, quote unquote, American instrument has its roots in West Africa, which happens because we enslaved so many people, right? And if you tell that out, you can't tell the story of the US. And does it raise uncomfortable questions? Yes. But then you don't know who you are, right? All the reasons I was told to study history is because it tells you who you are. If you don't know who you are, how do you have a future if you don't have a past, right? And I think the question that I want to pose to the panel, just thinking through this, is how do we decide what to teach, or who is deciding what's being taught? LaTisha, you talked a little bit about legislative models, but prior to this moment in history, there had to have been other decisions made, right? The textbook market, who's writing it, how does that get developed? Thoughts and reflections on that. And not on the technical side necessarily, right? But just thinking about what's at play in terms of what type of history we're telling or whose history we're telling.
Well, I think about it today in regards to our our national political climate, for example. And unfortunately, the teaching of history has often become politicized.
Yes.
And it is really based on the political agenda. Therefore, I'm going to say something that might be politically controversial. So I shouldn't teach that because, I might get in trouble or might not be able to. For example, we don't teach about Palestine because it is highly politicized, very controversial. It's a taboo topic. And oftentimes I try to educate others on it in terms of, I'm not speaking political, I'm talking identity, teaching people that this identity of people does exist. Let's take out the political jargon and teach about these people as a population. So again, I think that because of all the politics, we are unable to teach what is raw and real, and the true history. Instead, we have all of this misinformation out there. And then we have Hollywood teaching us about history, which oftentimes is very misinformed and incorrect.
Phillip, do you want in on this as a former history teacher?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with what I'm hearing. And, I've thought over the years that it is both an intentional deselection of stories, as well as an intentional selection of other stories. And so I think that the human experience is complex. And I think a good example that I was working with a group of high school teachers recently, and they're going to be teaching John Brown and Harper's Ferry. And I simply asked them, what would happen if you asked your students to do a Google image search for John Brown? And if you do a Google image search, what images come up? And in one, you see him holding a Bible, and another, you see him in a very violent depiction. And so even just in images, look at which images are the majority. And how does that happen in terms of selection of stories? And I tend to not think that it's by accident. I think that there are ways that we as Americans get attached to certain stories, and our egos and our and who we are, our identities get attached to perpetuating those stories. So I think that whether it's John Brown Google image search, or if you look at Brown v. Board of Education, I'm also in South Carolina, and very few people know about the Briggs case in Clarendon County that was bundled into that legislation, and how parents were upset in Clarendon County about unjust busing. And so how do certain events, how do certain people get foregrounded and others get backgrounded? And I'm really interested in why that occurs and what that is perpetuating, because I don't think that it's necessarily by accident. I think that there are motives to telling the stories that make us feel best about who we are, and avoiding the ones that can be uncomfortable and are uncomfortable for a reason.
Phillip, could you just say a word about the John Brown story and what it is people can expect when they Google, and why it's relevant?
Yeah.
Just because I think we don't want people Googling at the same time they're paying attention to us. So if you just walk us through that would be great.
As a former history teacher, I'm certainly in my own echo chamber of like other history teachers, right? But I think if we look back on the experience of John Brown leading the raid on Harper's Ferry, and how he and those that were with him were trying to bring action to stop the violent enslavement that was occurring. If you do the Google image search, or even if you just do a regular Google image search, look at the first paragraph in Wikipedia that is describing him, for example, and those that were supporting him in this raid on this place where they were holding weapons, military weapons, and their plan was to get some weaponry to then try and end enslavement. So if you look at the words that were being used in any depiction, Wikipedia, anywhere on the internet, was this a raid? Was it a violent uprising? Like, what words are used to depict it gives a window into the perspective that people are trying to tell about it. And it's no different with John Brown, or if we look at any other event that we as Americans experience but have different perspectives of. And I think that the other thing I would say about that is there is a wonderful 1950 Japanese film called Rashomon. I don't know if anyone knows this film. And it's a black and white film about a samurai that was killed. And it's told from the perspective of multiple people within the village. And all of the individuals have a different perspective of what happened. And so the discomfort sometimes in history is acknowledging that as we have shared experiences, there's overlap in the way that we tell the story of what happened. But many times there's great disagreement and variance about the perspective that we're telling and the story that we're perpetuating. So no matter which historical event we use, we could use the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Look in a textbook, look at the paragraph that is written, the words that are used, and that gives a window into the way that we're positioning people and stories and the perspective. I hope that adds a little bit of depth to that.
It absolutely does, Phillip. And just as a quick aside, I had a high school teacher in history, a history teacher in high school, who made watching Rashomon a homework assignment for the very reasons you described, which started my love of Kurosawa films.
Yes.
And thinking about the contentiousness of history, you mentioned Hiroshima and the dropping of the bomb. Enola Gay, which was the plane that dropped the bomb, went on display at the Smithsonian, I want to say about 10 years ago. And there was a great deal of debate about the labeling. And is this something that brought an end to the war? Or was this a a test of a nuclear weapon after the war was over, and how does this get described? And so I think, we tend to think about curriculum in school settings, which is very important. But as Ronnie also hinted at, we've got Hollywood that tells stories, we've got museums that tell stories, and think about all these other spaces where history as story is being told. And that might be something we can come to, but I know, Kim, I think you wanted to jump in on this as well.
Yeah, thank you. When we were talking about teaching history, it's very interesting because I support a lot of schools, but I often remind, especially from within that arts perspective, that teaching in a classroom is a fairly modern notion. So the arts have been teaching history in these, through the community, through a song, through the imagery. It's these not necessarily subversive or covert, but it's just in a more organic, more in that sort of communal context, which I think is very interesting to all of the previous comments, and particularly with Phillip in terms of those multiple perspectives, to the point of the banjo or an instrument, and how the arts might help us deal with those more uncomfortable and things that may bring out feelings of guilt. I share that. My family is from South Carolina. There's that lineage that can go back and be traced, and it's not all necessarily favorable. It's not something I really want to, wear externally, but must confront that as part of the story and the truth that is there. But I think sometimes the arts can provide those entry points of something that we do share in common, that there's an appreciation for the art form itself, and that can oftentimes open up a door for the conversations of the uncomfortable and the unknown and the and what we haven't been able to talk about yet. And so particularly to your the Omar opera, I'm very excited about that. I hope that might bring that story to life in somewhere outside the classroom, and that begins how might the arts come back into those classrooms? Because Phillip, I would agree the textbook has got some like sort of stage imagery, and not that art doesn't have some staged imagery. Trust me, I understand that as well. But all of these different conversations, and I don't really know where that particularly lands. And I'm going to toss this out here as the new art form of media. That is really beginning to shift these stories, and seeing the stories in real time and the different perspectives being told at that same moment, and how these art forms of media is beginning to engage well outside the classroom. These are things we can't control in that little classroom anymore. It's really so not to get off track, because I think I saw Rania. She wants to add something else to that conversation.
No, you're saying so many things that I want to comment on, that I agree with, that I get. In terms of media, I think that it's actually it's a wonderful thing. It might be dangerous in some ways, but I think that it's actually allowed a lot of youth to be able to tell their stories in a way out that the classroom never allowed them to. And so they are able to express themselves, to share their perspectives, their oral histories, in ways that they might never get a chance to at all in K-12, right? And then I also wanted to comment on what Phillip was saying in regard to the language used and how we tell these stories in the textbooks, or even just orally in a classroom. I'm often reminded of, I taught English forever, and we talk so much about word choice and euphemisms and dysphemisms, and students are always just so excited to learn how they can use one phrase and completely change the meaning of something or downplay the meaning of something. And I always use the example of collateral damage in my classroom. I think it's the most popular one to use when you explain it to students. And we read the phrase in history textbooks all the time. And sadly, what it does is it desensitizes kids to thinking, oh, well, that population didn't matter. They were collateral damage, because it's become such a numbing term, I guess, except we're forgetting that we are erasing people, invisible or unheard when we use terms like that. So I think that teaching kids, even through history, on how to read these textbooks, how to read what the teacher is telling them, to teach them how to have their own perspectives and not always take everything so literally, is extremely important.
Can I jump in really quickly? Just one comment. So I think I just wanted to expand on not only the importance of the language used and the points made by Dr. Rania and Dr. Phillip, but also like who we are choosing to represent historical figures. So it's interesting to me, like in Hollywood, where we have these movies about, let's say, Cleopatra, right, back in the day. And Elizabeth Taylor does not look like she's from Egypt, right? Or like Charlton Heston, who was, back in the day when we were talking about the movie, I think it was Jesus Christ of Nazareth or whatever. And so I do agree with Dr. Phillip that there is some intentionality around the language and who is put out as representatives of kind of our important figures in history. And we have to explore why that is, right? So what, back to, I think, I keep coming back to our original question, like, whose story are we valuing? Why do we feel like putting forth certain stories versus others are important? And then the conversation about media is really interesting to me. I have 2 teenage daughters, and I will be honest with you, they learn more on TikTok about history than they do in their actual history class. Yeah. And so the idea now that our young people are able to see multiple and different perspectives of even historical events, they will come and tell me, did you know this and this? They watched a TikTok and I'm like, oh no, I didn't know that. And so I think, even though we all are concerned about the amount of media that our young people are digesting, I do think it's been a powerful tool for children around learning about different perspectives of events. Even if we think about, some of the events that have happened in the last, year and a half, 2 years around things like police brutality and the perspectives that we're able to see from somebody who's filming something on a cell phone, right? And we would have never seen that perspective before, or cameras on police officers now and being able to see the actual events of what happened. To me, it all all of this works together in this conversation, because it really is about us being able to see multiple perspectives of a particular issue or a particular point in history. And for me, for children, it's not just learning about the historical event, it's how we become critical thinkers and we learn from the events of the past.
Absolutely. I just really quick, funny comment. When you were talking about Cleopatra, any Arab would know that when you watch any type of Hollywood movie, that's not what Arabs sound like.
Right.
First of all, Arabs do not speak in formal Arabic, probably ever. I don't even know how to speak in formal Arabic. And then they hire all of these non-Arab actors to speak in Arabic, and the accent is absolutely terrible. So it's inauthentic. Whereas if I were to watch things on TikTok nowadays, or see a Facebook video or IG, etc., a lot of that is told by the youth themselves. You are hearing the language, you're hearing their personal stories. And who's to say that that personal story isn't as valuable as the story of someone in our textbook?
And I think
sorry, Kim, I just want to add a quick clarifying thing here. When Rania's talking about Arabic, there are 2 registers of modern Arabic. There's a standard one for newscasts, literature and so on. And then there's a spoken Arabic, which can vary not only across countries, but even within countries. And, it's sort of the way we think about dialects in the U.S. functions very similar in the Arab world. So just so to give people a little bit of context.
Yeah. And Rania, when you were speaking, I think it helped me provide a little bit more clarity of what I really was trying to get with the other comment, trying to squeeze in like my reactions to everyone else's comments. But that art, when we talk about things that are uncomfortable, I think that there's that authenticity to the emotional, to the concept of emotions within. It doesn't matter. We have all felt sorrow. We have all felt joy. And I think that's where the arts can help in telling those stories. And there's a way to really hear that story from something that we can connect to. It may not be our personal history, but when I hear a piece of music, even if I don't understand the lyrics, I feel the emotion, and I can connect to that history in a way that I, as an audience, feels authentic.
I just want to come back to the power of media for a second, or continue the conversation, I should say, Kim, because you're talking about the emotive context, but also understanding the ways it does add complexity, which people have talked about. But Rania, you talked about collateral damage, and the term of art before collateral damage was casualties of war. And I remember quite vividly, and I can't say it's causal, but it's definitely a correlation. There was a book that came out with the name Casualties of War, which was turned into a film with Michael J. Fox. I want to say early 90s. And it was right around that time that you had a move from using casualties of war to collateral damage, instead of saying we killed a bunch of civilians for no apparent reason, which is a bigger mouthful, but feels more accurate. And so, again, thinking about how media plays a role in that. And also thinking about the stories that are being told. So obviously we have got, One Night in Miami, which looks at a particular potential imaginal meeting between Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X. I'm sorry, why am I forgetting the other two characters in this? It will come to me, but you have this One Night in Miami, or Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, or the series on Madam C.J. Walker, right? Stories that would have been unimaginable 10 years ago, right, are now not just being made, but being made on major streaming platforms. And there's that element. And I think, Kim, this is where I want to sort of delve a little bit. Just as history becomes contentious, right? Because I don't know how to think in terms of complexity. I don't know how to understand history that's different than the way I understand it in a meta sense. And then can art function the same way, right? How does it become a way to say, I can feel with you in a generic sense, right? But then does it become contentious when you say, but the reason you feel this way is because of very particular historical things that then make me uncomfortable, so therefore I can no longer feel with you, right? Mm-hmm. So in other words, art as being a door, being a window, and doors and windows close. Right. So how do we navigate that? Right. Because we're not moving away from history. And I want to thank LaTisha and LaTisha, who's behind the scenes, for pointing out that One Night in Miami is Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, Jim Brown, and Sam Cooke, an imaginary meeting between the four of them. So thank you for that. So again, Kim, that comment or that question isn't directed to you, but I'm wondering now, how do we build? Like, arts is an opening, but how far does the opening go before we run into the same issues that we're dealing with in history, right? Or is just that discomfort? And I forget who said it, but somebody said, arts as a way of dealing with being uncomfortable, and a welcoming uncomfortableness. is that sufficient to then get beyond the barrier, right? Because we're beyond the intellectual at that point. So whoever wants to feel that, if anybody wants to feel that, we can go someplace else.
I just want to add a quick response, and then I want to listen to what the rest of your thoughts are on that. But I think that the arts have a gravitation towards subjectivity that the teaching of history has historically, no pun intended, not, right? And so there's an assumed subjectivity. And it reminds me of the work of Sam Weinberg at Stanford. And he has looked into the historical thinking skills that historians use. And what he discovered was that one of the skills that they use is called sourcing. As soon as they are reading any artifact, viewing any movie clip, looking at any piece of art, they automatically kind of habitually say, who created this? Who is this person? What is their perspective? What would be gained from perpetuating or pushing forward this perspective? So I would argue that this historical thinking skill, along with a couple others, are inherently what it is about to have a quest for equity, a quest for more justice in this country, is that can we help students and can we model that that habit of saying, okay, let me source this. Let me think about not only who is the perspective being pushed forward, but if there's a discomfort that I feel, what is that saying about me first? Can I look internal first and say, okay, why am I feeling this? And what is the most loving, compassionate interpretation of this story that considers others who may not see it in the same way? And I just think that is a skill that is so critically important to education in this country and to really creating communities that we desire. I want to listen to other thoughts on that. Or not on my response, but on your question, I should say.
One thought that just comes to mind quickly, I'm a mother of 3 young boys, and it's, what I want to do my entire life is protect them and shield them and coddle them, right, as any mother. But I think it's important that we teach the skills of uncomfort, to teach kids that it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to learn about things that don't make you feel great on the inside. And, my son watched a movie, gosh, I forget which movie it was, but I think it was called The Patriot. And it was a Muslim kid that was the villain. And he said to me, why are Muslim kids always the bad guys, Mom? I just hate it. It just makes me feel so uncomfortable. So I never tell people that I'm Muslim. And so that, I think, is not okay for any child to feel. And sometimes we do that to some kids in order to make other kids feel comfortable, the majority of kids. And so I think I'm answering or responding to what you're saying, Phillip, but that thought came to me right away that there's nothing wrong with making students feel uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah. And how could we support, if I were your son's teacher, how could I support him in using his voice to speak truth?
Yes.
Right? To speak back against a narrative and narratives that are, patently false about him and others.
Yes.
And Ronnie, as you're saying this, we make some kids feel bad to make other kids feel good. And I don't disagree with you, but I wonder how that also relates to, I think, Phillip, you started the conversation a little bit earlier about explicit decisions versus implicit decisions, right? So is it really about the intentionality of, is this a zero-sum game where some kid has to feel bad for another kid to feel good? Or is it that just accept that there's a normativity to who is good and therefore everybody else must be bad? And we can construct those histories. So even when the majority is no longer the majority, which is the case we're in right now with the United States, the cultural idioms that we use, the deep stories that we rely on are so informed by that we're not actually being conscious in how we're addressing that. And I'll be very specific. Again, as a researcher on Muslims in the US, right, the ways in which anti-Black racism suffuses the academy, right? So when we talk about Muslims in the US, it's almost invariably from 1965 onwards. Or if you really want to push it, the birth of the Nation of Islam, or the rise of the Nation of Islam, I should say, in the 1930s, 40s. But nobody's talking about the Arab Muslim migrants who came in the 19th century. And absolutely no one until fairly recently was talking about the enslaved Muslims who were here from the 18th century onwards, right? Or late 17th century onwards. And so it's not because anybody was saying Black Muslims are important, but it's because we are in an environment that is suffused with anti-Black racism, and there has to be an there has to be a conscious undoing of that worldview and of that deep story in order to be able to engage with some of that history and some of that disciplinary work.
I would agree. And I think what I've been thinking about as we're having this conversation is exactly what you're saying, which is I think, part of our why things are so controversial is that we haven't really had the racial reckoning that we need to have in this country around our history and around really just the atrocities that have occurred. And I think comfortability, which is actually that's a coded word because most minorities in this country never feel comfortable. And so it is the culture of our country to make certain people feel comfortable and others not, as was previously stated. And so I think really this idea, like I love the idea of the arts being a window and a door. But ultimately, unless we can have the true, authentic conversations about what has happened in this country from all perspectives, right? Because everyone has a perspective of what has happened. I can tell you, what has happened with my family and the impacts that has had, and somebody else's experience could be very different, and no perspective is more valuable than the other, right? But I think, where it starts is conversations like this, right? Where we're questioning, we're thinking about why certain narratives or why certain stories are told, because really there's a lot of just history we don't even know because it has been hidden from us.
So I'll come back very quickly to history and TikTok. I'm not a regular TikTok person, but there is one creator who I follow quite regularly, and because the context of South Carolina is relevant for us, for some of us, who is an instructor at Harvard in the Gullah language, and he does a TikTok video called "We Out Ya."
Yes.
Which is, as LaTisha, who I'm sorry because I'm so bad with creator names. I don't even remember the channel names. So, but he does probably 3 or 4 times a week a little bit of Sun Tzu. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. He 3 or 4 times a week he does a little linguistic piece. Like this thing is part of our popular language, but then he traces it back to either Black communities broadly or very specifically Gullah communities, and then intertwines it with history and the cultural moment. And it's fascinating. And I don't think I've ever seen a video longer than 2.5 minutes, and the amount he packs in there and the ways it just expands your mind about what is possible. And again, the histories of this country, I think, are just phenomenal. So, I'm always looking as an educator for things that exist outside the official histories, because that's where you get the multiple perspectives, right? Our textbooks, and I think Phillip said this, make a move towards objectivity and facts. But I think what they really settle on is that they are the totality of perspectives rather than a perspective. And I think that's one of the most important learnings I have to give to my students when they come into my class, is that we're going to do lots of perspectives. And I'm not a historian. We don't do history. But everything we've now got to make more complex.
Hussein, interestingly, I bet that with this generation especially, that learning about linguistics through that TikTok video will be more memorable and something that they will retain. That, not to say that there's anything wrong with any linguistics class, but then a linguistics class.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so on that note, I will ask you all as we approach the end of our time together, is there anything else you want to say, or is there any bit of advice, anything you want to shout out, last thoughts on history, education, and how we can create good chaos in the world?
I think this is something that we all said, is that every single voice in America matters. Every story is important. Every story is valuable. And as a teacher, I would encourage other teachers and educators to allow for every student's voice to be heard in their classroom.
And Rania, I'll just build on that, is with to providing that space for our students to tell their stories, and that there are many ways to tell that story, including creating arts and helping tell their stories in multiple ways, not only the multiple stories from multiple perspectives, but multiple forms of storytelling.
I would just say the greatest gift we can give to any student is to support them in creating and defending historical narratives. They have endless resources. They don't need us to tell them history. They can go to YouTube, Wikipedia, anywhere else. But can we engage them in weighing historical narratives and using a lens of justice and compassion and community to say, now, how can we tell history in a way that is most loving?
And I would agree with all of our panelists today. I think, back to my original point, who are we trying to create, and what are we trying to accomplish? If we want to create critical thinkers, we have to think about the teaching of history very differently. And so to bring in those multiple perspectives, to value diverse thinking about history is just as important as children learning historical facts.
Yep.
I want to thank all of you for joining the panel this evening. It's been a fascinating conversation. I think we'd probably go for another hour, but I really, really do appreciate this. I want to thank the audience who's joining us for this panel right now. Thank you for being with us this evening, or whenever you're watching this. And please remember that we do have additional panel discussions coming up. We have other panel discussions on the website already. So please do check them out and join us for other events in the future. Thank you all. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, LaTisha and Mina, for having us here at Spoleto.